Hello and welcome to Mann Roland Print Technology Center. We are very pleased to be included in the REPM conference, and from here we like to open the series of the conference contribution.
Dear audience, I'm very pleased to be here at Mann Roland Sheetfed, and my many thanks go to Wilhelm Graef as he introduced our situation here at the Graphic Center for Technology to welcome the REPM conference, and I'm pleased to introduce you to Dr. Eva Hanewood-Benz, who's going to be the first speaker in our lecture program. And she is going to speak about printing in the Rhine-Main area. Thank you.
Dear colleagues, dear friends, it is a great pleasure to be with you again after such a while. Special greetings go to Alan Marshall and to Johann de Soete, and I'm especially grateful to Stefan Soltek to have me here to make a speech. And he also suggested the contents of the speech, which runs like know-how upriver, downriver, printing and books in the Rhine-Main area. The annual meeting of REPM 2021 is taking place in Offenbach on the Main, in the Rhine-Main region, a region named after the rivers whose confluence is not far from here. The towns and cities of Offenbach, Frankfurt, Mainz and Darmstadt are situated here in close proximity. This is where stood the cradle of the letterpress printing of the Western world, and where the further development of printing was advanced and documented in many ways. It was in Mainz that the first printed books were made in the workshop of Johannes Gutenberg, member of one of the leading families of Mainz. It is probable that he had prepared the technique of letterpress printing from 1440 onwards in Strasbourg, up the Rhine, by creating lead type and a printing press. The first printed book that can be dated, the Gutenberg Bible of 1454, was created in Mainz following some smaller printed works. Why just here? One may well ask. Mainz, ruled by an archbishop who was also the leading elector, had a court which offered extensive means of living and working to artists and artisans. Here one could make contact with all sorts of arts and crafts. Money was minted, work in metal flourished, and experienced painters provided information about the composition of the still new oil paintings. Further, Mainz, with its port on the Rhine and its bridge across the river, occupied an excellent central position for communications in Europe. Important trade routes crossed at Mainz and Frankfurt, leading directly to far distant countries. A south-north running trading route starting at Basel and passing alongside the Black Forest and the Odenwald Forest went to Frankfurt, and there divided into three branches which led westwards alongside the Rhine to Cologne, northwards to Bremen, Hamburg and Lübeck via Marburg and Kassel, and eastwards to Leipzig and then Berlin. From Mainz, Frankfurt was accessible not only by road, but also by a regular and fast connection by ship. The area was therefore open to technical development, and there were existing channels of distribution. Further, the sense of invention, of industriously doing small and fiddly mechanical work, inborn in many Germans, must have had an effect too. Letterpress printing is a good example to show the strong links among European countries already existing in the 15th century. Gutenberg's most important assistant, Peter Schöffer from Gernsheim on the Rhine, had been a student and scribe at the University of the Sorbonne at Paris, where he had worked at the manufacture of handwritten books. He was well versed in efficient production methods. From 1462 onwards, letterpress printing spread quickly to other towns and countries through the agency of students and members of Gutenberg's workshop. The great interest in this innovation is shown by the example of Nicolas Jensen, a master of minting from Tours in France, who was sent by the French King Charles VII in 1458 to Mainz to learn the art of printing and to disseminate it in France. Jensen did learn from Gutenberg, but did not return to his home country. Instead, he stayed in the monastery of Marienthal in the Rheingau area, before then going to Venice as a printer. Following the foundation of Gutenberg's workshop or workshops, 6 further printing workshops were established in Mainz during the early days of printing. Johannes Fust, originally the business partner of Gutenberg, and Peter Scheffer, with whom he ran the second workshop in Mainz, saw good business opportunities in nearby Frankfurt. One can assume that in 1454, during the Frankfurt Fair, Fust offered the gatherings of the Gutenberg Bible for sale. Scheffer, who after Fust's death continued to work as an independent printer, gained civil rights there in 1479 and could, in consequence, acquire a house which served his far-reaching business. During his long working life, Scheffer succeeded in building a large business concern which included, beside printing, type founding, publishing and distribution, also other business interests, as for instance participation in mining. Scheffer's activities extended throughout Europe. At times he ran branches in Paris, Basel, Trier, Angers, and perhaps in Cologne. Further, he traded not only with his own products but with those of numerous European printing houses. Scheffer can justifiably be called the first publisher. He was also the first who, together with Fust, used a printing mark, or a printer's mark, and the first who distributed for advertising purposes a printed list of books, which doubled as a sample of printed typefaces. Scheffer and Konrad Henkes, who had married Fust's widow and carried on with this printing office, founded in a certain sense the Frankfurt Book Fair by turning the already existing general fair into a trade center for printed works. Frankfurt joined the circle of German printing towns surprisingly late, perhaps because the proximity of Mainz was a reason. There was no need for its own printing development. Peter Scheffer carried out in Mainz several printing jobs for the city of Frankfurt, and as late as 1509, the definitive statute book of the Free City, the so-called Frankfurt Reformation, was printed in Mainz by Johann Scheffer, the son of Peter Scheffer. The first tangible appearance of letterpress printing in Frankfurt was an intermezzo. Between 1511 and 1513, the Alsatian Franciscan monk Thomas Murner and his brother Beatus, a printer from Strasbourg, were responsible for the first 9 works demonstrably printed in Frankfurt, thin booklets and pamphlets. Also be mentioned must be Wilhelm Rudel, who appears in Frankfurt documents for the first time in 1495 and who listed as a printer, but none of his printed works has survived. Like everything else, letterpress printing was seriously affected by periods of radical change. Frankfurt, as a political entity, adhered to the Augsburger Confession or Augustan Confession. That means it supported the Reformed Lutheran Church, even though Catholicism always retained its importance here. That meant that thousands of Calvinists, subject to persecution at home, poured into Frankfurt. Among them was the first Frankfurt printer publisher of importance, Christian Egenolf, who ran a printing house here from 1531 up to his death in 1555. He printed, among others, the first Reformed Frankfurt Bible, which, sumptuously fashioned, appeared in 1534. Other important printers of the 16th and 17th centuries from among this group were Jost Ammann, Sigmund Feierabend, Theodor de Brey, as well as Matthäus Merian and his family. The houses of de Brey and Merian made Frankfurt into the leading sites for intaglio printing in the 17th century. Both printing houses created in their workshops masterworks of copperplate printing and etching. Here again, one is struck by the influx of people from across Europe. Following the death of his client Sigmund Feierabend, the Belgian copperplate engraver Theodor de Brey moved in 1590 from Strasbourg to Frankfurt and gained civil rights through marriage. His firm printed and published, among others, The Arrival of Columbus in the New World in 1594, as well as West Indian Travels and East Indian Travels, somewhat later, which are among the most important collections of travel reports of the early modern era. After his death in 1598, his sons, Johann Theodor and Johann Israel de Brey, continued his publishing activities. One of Theodor de Brey's daughters married the copperplate engraver Matthäus Merian, who came from Basel. He too moved to Frankfurt and founded here his own publishing house. One of his monumental printed works, the history Theatrum Europaeum, must be mentioned here. At the time of his death, this work consisted of 5 volumes and, continued by his heirs and successors, was finished only in 1738, comprising 21 volumes. They contained 720 copperplate engravings, 120 of which were engraved by the printer himself. Altogether, 40 copperplate engravers who signed the work took also part. Merian's sons, too, were among the most celebrated copperplate engravers of their time. His daughter Maria Sibylle Merian, who was from a second marriage, was a famous painter of flowers and insects. She went to Suriname as a natural scientist and published her work with colored copperplate illustrations. Among the sons-in-law of Merian Senior was Christian Leblanc of Flemish stock, whose grandson Jacob Christoph Leblanc invented intaglio printing in colors using 4 color plates. These few examples are to give an impression of the extent to which publishing and printing were shaped by connections between the different countries. In Frankfurt in 1573, the first German regulations for letterpress printers were formulated and used. Since printing was not covered by the guilds, there had been no binding rules before. Now times of work, of training, wages and other things were decided on and set down in writing. A short while later, another step in the development of letterpress printing was taken in Frankfurt. Here in 1577, the first independent type foundry that was not attached to a printing enterprise came into being. The reason for this happening was a quarrel about inheritance. Jacob Sabon, he worked in 1557 for Egenulf's widow and left the city to work for Plantain and Antwerp, but returned 1564 to Frankfurt. In 1571, he married Judith Egenulf, a granddaughter of Christian Egenulf, thereby acquiring civil rights in Frankfurt and becoming a partner in the firm Egenulf Erben, or heirs of Egenulf. Quarrels within the family led to a settlement that granted him the type foundry, which he, together with his wife, then ran as an independent enterprise. Sabon became the creator of important typefaces and, on a basis of colleague to colleague, had friendly contacts with the designers and typecutters Claude Garamond in Paris and Robert Grandjean in Lyon. His widow became the wife of Konrad Börner from Hechingen in a second marriage, and Börner continued the enterprise to whom we owe the famous Börner specimen of type of 1592 showing Garamond type. This type foundry laid the foundation for the worldwide importance to which type founding rose in Frankfurt. The well-known type foundries that were later active in Frankfurt included names like Luther, Dressler, Flinch, the Bauer Foundry and the David Stempel AG. Since the 16th century, the Frankfurt Spring and Autumn Fairs had been among the most important dates for book wholesalers who arranged their travels and production times accordingly. As a trade center for books, Frankfurt played a leading role in the whole of Europe until the late 17th century. During the Age of Enlightenment in the 18th century, this role was gradually assumed by Leipzig. However, until 1869, Frankfurt remained, after Leipzig, the most important book trading center in Germany, where a wide spectrum of books was offered and works were also sold on commission. It was only after the division of Germany resulting from the Second World War that the Frankfurt Book Fair was refounded by the Börsenverein des Deutschen Buchhandels, the Association of the German Book Trade, this time purely as a book fair. Within a few years, the main part of the firms represented were foreign publishers. Thus, in the 20th century, Frankfurt became once more an international, world-leading city of books. The Rhine-Main area also played an important part for certain graphic printing techniques, which is maybe less well known. Here was the starting point for the early dissemination of mezzotint in lithography. The mezzotint technique, known in Germany as Schabkunst, literally it means scrape art, was developed by the aristocratic, soldier and amateur copperplate engraver Ludwig von Siegen. He was born in Cologne. It is the earliest graphic printing process where the inventor is known by name. In 1642, he sent his first known and dated mezzotint sheet from Amsterdam to the Landgrave of Hessen-Kassel, his former employer. Afterwards, however, he showed little interest in the further development of the technique. He passed on his invention to Dietrich Caspar von Fürstenberg, who in 1656 took up mezzotint in Mainz and, supported by the Archbishop, engaged intensively during the following years in this branch of the arts. Mezzotint prints, having some of the quality of painting, they appealed to the taste of the time and were well received. A further representative of mezzotint was another noble dilettante, Prince Ruprecht von der Pfalz. He, from 1655 onwards, spent some of his time in Mainz also. The early mezzotint prints fell into the categories of portrait, devotional prints and genre. The two amateur graphic artists, because of their good contacts in aristocratic circles, easily found customers of repute. One of the early professional representatives of mezzotint was the painter Valéran Vaillant from French Flanders. In 1658, Vaillant met Prince Ruprecht von der Pfalz in Frankfurt and learned from him the mezzotint technique, which he practiced at first in Frankfurt and later in the Netherlands. This again had a major influence on its further dissemination. Soon the know-how of mezzotint printing spread via the Netherlands also to Great Britain, where it achieved its greatest flowering in the 18th century. Since then, this technique had been regarded largely as an Anglo-Saxon achievement. Shortly before the beginning of the 19th century, Offenbach on the Rhine then became the starting point of a Europe-wide dissemination of lithography. During the years 1797 to 98, Alois Senefelder, who was born in Prague, had developed the process of flatbed printing from stone, and in cooperation with the musician and composer Franz Gleisner, as financial backer, he had started a small printing workshop for sheet music in Munich. For this very first, still very modest lithographic institution, the Bavarian elector Maximilian Joseph granted Senefelder in 1799 a license for Bavaria. The new invention was of interest to Anton André, a dealer in music and owner of a printing firm that printed music from copper plate and was situated in Offenbach. André, member of a Huguenot family, had visited Senefelder's workshop in the same year and was convinced of the efficiency of lithography. André suggested to Senefelder that they should cooperate, and for 2,000 gulden or guilders, he was given the necessary information about the new chemical printing method. Further, André set up a printing works for the inventor in Offenbach, where Senefelder personally trained specialists in the printing of music. The enterprise was helped by an important historical coincidence. In this very year, André had acquired from Mozart's widow, Constanze, the complete musical estate of the genius who had died in 1791. The publication of these works during the following years ensured continuing financial success for the firm that traded under the name of Notenfabrik André. As a far-seeing businessman, André immediately looked abroad to further utilize the printing method, and in agreement with Senefelder, sent his brothers Philip and Friedrich André to London, respectively Paris, to establish branch lithography printing works there. Although Senefelder's efforts to gain financial success were met by repeated setbacks during the following years, nothing could stop lithography's triumphal march around the world from here. Offenbach, up to then hardly noticeable as a printing town, stood out in the 19th and 20th centuries on account of some important type foundries. Established in 1834, the Bredische Schriftgießerei was the first, soon joined by the firms Reininger, Nies & Co., and in 1859 by the Ruthardsche Schriftgießerei. This last one was taken over in 1892 by Klingspor and run from 1895 by his sons Karl and Wilhelm. This firm traded from 1906 under the name of Gebrüder Klingspor. Other relevant enterprises were the type foundries Huck, Rust and Roos und Junge, which came during the run of the 19th century. Some of these firms were established by type founders from Frankfurt who were looking for independence and founded in the smaller neighboring town. Among those mentioned, it was a Klingspor type foundry that impressed by its innovations in creating typefaces and book ornamentation. In 1907, the firm was among the 12 enterprises which founded the Deutsche Werkbund, or German Arts and Crafts Society. It employed important graphic artists and type designers like Peter Behrens, Otto Eckmann, Otto Hupp, Rudolf Koch, Gerhard Munte and Walter Tiemand, among others, and supplied printing offices throughout the world. Among its best-known typefaces were, during the Art Nouveau era, one called Eckmann, by Otto Eckmann of course. Another one, also named after the designer, was called Behrens, and later there were Kabel and Neuland, designed by Rudolf Koch, and many other typefaces. In the decorative sphere, the book ornamentations by Heinrich Vogeler, the painter and graphic artist, were exemplary. Everyone present here probably knows that the private library of Karl Klingspor, the Junior, became the basis of the collections of the Klingspor Museum, which was founded in 1953. Type from Frankfurt and Offenbach type foundries was literally sold all over the world and served as a model for other firms working in the field. Since the various branches of the printing industry were historically important and because of the prevalence of publishing in the Rhine-Main region, the historical dimension was taken into account relatively early. The first Gutenberg monument by Eduard Scholl was created in 1827 on the initiative of the Casino Society in Mainz, a political reading club. It can still be seen in the Gutenberg Museum nowadays. Then, in 1837, the bigger Gutenberg Memorial by Bertel Thorvaldsen was erected in Mainz on the Theaterplatz, or Theatre Square. On the occasion of the celebrations in 1840 of the invention of letterpress printing, a monument was unveiled in Frankfurt on the Rossmarkt, which showed Gutenberg, Fuste and Schoeffer together as a group. It was created by Eduard Schmidt von der Launitz. The composition, which gives equal weight to the three men, was at first a target for numerous critics. However, considering Schoeffer's contributions, one cannot deny its justification. In 1900, to celebrate the assumed 500th birthday of Johannes Gutenberg, there was in Mainz an extensive exhibition which dazzled with many important exhibits. It was supported by all important enterprises of the German printing business. The large number of donated exhibits formed the nucleus of a museum collection which was affiliated to the City Library of Mainz. The library's own collections provided additional manuscripts and printed materials to complete the permanent exhibition. During the first decades, the director of the library also acted as the director of the new Gutenberg Museum, which was administered only by the city. Since 1901, the museum had been supported by the International Gutenberg Society, founded in Mainz, to which many relevant publications are owed. Important became the Gutenberg Yearbook from 1925 onwards. It was a characteristic of the Gutenberg Museum from the start that both the means of production and the products themselves were collected. That means printing presses, casting and typesetting machines and other implements, as well as printed works of all kinds. In 1926, it was possible to acquire one volume of the Gutenberg Bible, the B42, and in 1978, a complete Gutenberg Bible with 2 volumes. One specialty of the museum, the representation of East Asia printing history, developed through close contacts with China and South Korea, which were underpinned by museum partnerships in 2000 and 2004 respectively. The Gutenberg Museum's early decades coincided with a phase of intensive investigation into the technical aspects of early printing. Gustav Mori, a typesetter and self-taught researcher from Frankfurt, reconstructed in cooperation with the directors of the Gutenberg Museum and the Deutsche Museum or German Museum in Munich, a Gutenberg printing press. He was also supported by the Stempel Type Foundry. 2 specimens were constructed for the 2 institutions during the 1920s. These so-called Gutenberg presses were models for many further reconstructions all over the world. Further, the technical aspects of the early colored prints in Peter Schoeffer's Psalter of Mainz of 1457 were reconstructed by Gustav Mori in practical trials, and in this context the Stempel AG Type Foundry reproduced the typefaces of the B42 in the 36-line Bible in simplified form. In this form they are, as I believe, available for sale until today. A donation by 2 local collectors of art led in Frankfurt to an institutional collection on the history of books. The brothers Michael and Albert Linel from Blieskastel, living in Frankfurt from 1861 and 63, had been collecting objects of art and of crafts throughout their lives. These included an important collection of medieval manuscripts, family registers, printed books, as well as ornamental printed pages and other types of printed graphic work. In agreement with the city's administration, they left this valuable collection the brothers left this valuable collection to the city of Frankfurt. At first it was exhibited in the house called Großer Engel on the Römerberg, in the center of the city. Later the collections were divided and assigned to the Städel Art Gallery and the Museum für Kunsthandwerk, nowadays Museum Angewandte Kunst. With this basic stock complemented by additional acquisitions, the Arts and Crafts Museum has been able since 1920 to make magnificent examples of book art available to the public. Examples ranging from illuminated manuscripts to fine presswork and livres d'artistes. The collection also includes type specimens, manuals of penmanship, book covers and examples of other branches of book and written culture. They justify the still existing name of the Linnell Collection Book and Written Art in the MAK, or Museum of Angewandte Kunst. From 1923 onwards, the Frankfurt Bibliophile Society had held big annual exhibitions in the rooms of the Linnell collection, and there were also special exhibitions with exhibits from own funds. There have been special exhibitions on the subject book up to the present times. The type founders of Frankfurt, many of whom belong to the organization Typographische Gesellschaft Frankfurt or Typographic Society Frankfurt, had for some time the intention to create their own museum, a first in the history of their profession. Gustav Mori, again, already mentioned, was the originator and competent spokesman for this plan, which was successfully realized. In 1940, a type foundry museum was established in the house Zum Alten Frosch, the Old Frog, in the Falkengasse in Frankfurt. It was formerly the building of the Egenolf Luther Foundry. Unfortunately, this institution was only of short duration. The building and its exhibits were destroyed by bombs of the Second World War. Nowadays, Frankfurt citizens or interested experts are hardly aware of this former special collection. The already mentioned Klingspor Museum was set up as a museum of the book which, since the time of Art Nouveau, has been documenting the visual aspects of printed works with type specimens, samples of writing, typography, illustrations and book covers. Particular attention was given to calligraphy, which was also actively cultivated. The Klingspor Museum also collected excellent examples of East Asian art, especially Japanese written art. Contemporary poster art was also made a subject, particularly during the last few years. Cooperation with the Hochschule für Gestaltung, the College of Design in Offenbach, has repeatedly resulted in interesting exhibitions, activities and publications. It is fair to say that due to its profile and the quality of its collections, the Klingspor Museum is a museum of world renown, a jewel among the Offenbach cultural institutions. A further important institution in the Rhine-Main area is the Haus für Industriekultur, a Museum of Industrial Culture in Darmstadt, administratively attached to the Landesmuseum Darmstadt. As the name indicates, this is a purely technical museum which was conceived as a working museum. It probably wouldn't have seen the light of day if it had not been for the teaching workshop for printing at the Technical University of Darmstadt. In 1985, the type foundry of the David Stempel firm was closed down. Only the digital section of the business survived. Despite lengthy efforts, an institution could not be found in Frankfurt willing to take over the machines, equipment and in particular the matrices for museum purposes. The museum was to run a type foundry but also to document the industrial period of printing by means of old printing presses, equipment for typesetting and graphic workshops. The idea was that the production of exemplary printed products should make it largely self-supporting. Following the example of the paper mill at Basel, the work of typesetting and printing was carried out voluntarily by former printers and by typesetters. Up to now, the machine typesetter Rainer Gerstenberg is on hand as an expert for machine typesetting, productively active apart from giving regular demonstrations, but he is likely to retire soon or has already retired, I'm not quite sure. The museum, established since 1995 in a former industrial building in the Kirchenallee in Darmstadt, could, however, not be sustained as an independent enterprise because of the financial difficulties. For administrative reasons attached to the Landesmuseum, it is kept but does not be developed anymore. Last but not least, has to be mentioned that one of the biggest flatbed printing machine firms in the world, Mann-Roland, is part of the region of Rhine-Main. Here in Offenbach it has his housing, and we are very happy and thankful that we could gather here. Thank you very much for your attention.